2 clicks.
Got to be 2 clicks. Got it. I was noticing that lemonade cup, and it's Camden's, and he doesn't know why he put his cup there. He just saw Dad did it, and so he put his cup up there, which I thought was kind of funny. This morning we're going to talk about coincidences. Have you experienced a coincidence in your life? Something just kind of random that you weren't expecting. Something that it could have been, God working behind the scenes if you believed in that sort of thing, but maybe not necessarily that's what it was. We're still kind of new to the area. My family moved into Ocala in August, and I'll never forget the most exciting coincidence for me as a new resident of Ocala was running into somebody that I knew in a store on the wrong side of town that I shouldn't have run into. Right? I met Mr. Spangler and his wife, and we both live over here, or we were both living here on this baseline side of town, and we went into Lowe's on the other side of town, near downtown, and we walked in, and they're standing there, and we kind of stop, and like, you're not supposed to be here. This is the wrong side of town for you. This is what a coincidence, and we talked about it for a while, and it worked itself out. But when you're new to an area, when you don't know anybody, it really is an exciting thing to just run into somebody that you know, isn't it? I've heard of people who go traveling, and maybe this is more common with snowbirds. They go traveling and spend a vacation somewhere, and they run into somebody from back home that they haven't seen in a number of years. It's like, well, why couldn't we have just called each other when we were at home, right? And made that connection. But as I mentioned to my boys this morning, we're going to look at the story of Esther, and God's name doesn't show up at all in this book, which is really interesting to me. Nowhere does it say that God did anything at all. This is the only book in Scripture where I'm almost tempted to say that God's not the main character. And the only reason why I'd be willing to say that is because he's not a character at all, if you're going to go by the text. But we're going to see God working behind the scenes, because God made promises. He made promises to Abraham that he was going to give him a ton of kids and that they were going to have a land. And he was like, all right, God, if that's what you say. And so God did that. And then he made some more promises to Moses and gave him a law that says, hey, look, if you guys will abide by my law, then I will be your God and you'll stay in this land and it's going to be really, really cool. But things didn't necessarily go according to those promises. And so things move along. They go through the period of Judges. We talked about Saul and what a fantastic king he was for all the days of his life. And then God makes some promises to David that, hey, you're a great king, you're seeking after my heart, and your line, all of your sons, you will always have a king on the throne, as long as, they're doing what they are supposed to be doing, right? Well, if you're familiar with the biblical narrative, that doesn't happen either. The kingdom is divided. Where we have one nation of Israel, we have two. The northern kingdom, which keeps the name Israel, and then the southern kingdom called Judah, right? And they still persist in their sin, which is really interesting. If you're not coming to Bible Fellowship, you're missing some interesting connections across Scripture, because we're not sharing notes, but these things are matching up really well. So I'm really excited. So the people persist in their sin. God sends prophets to say, hey, look, guys, cut it out. And they keep sinning. And so Israel, the northern kingdom, gets taken over. They get shipped out by, who was in there this morning? Who took the northern kingdom? Do you remember? Assyria. Right, the northern kingdom gets taken over by Assyria. Can you imagine, just for a second, because we live in a pretty cool country, what if half of the states, maybe more than half of the states, a greater than majority, just got taken over by Canada or something like that, and they got shipped up north where it's always ice? That would be a tremendous, terrible fate for them. It's very cold. We can't really wrap our minds around that. So you'd think that the southern kingdom would be like, oh, hey, God is serious about this sin stuff. Let's get our act together. And that doesn't happen. And Babylon, the nation, comes in and takes them. And the way they worked is they would come in and they would conquer the city, then they'd take all the people out and spread them all over so that they were in a new town. So that there was no coincidence of running into somebody that you knew in the shopping center, right? You're just completely isolated, and how are you going to form a nation if you don't have any of your people around? And that's kind of where we're at. So if you want to open your Bible to Esther, we're going to be in chapter 1, and we're going to walk through all of it. I'm going to turn this on. It is on. No, it's not. Okay. So the PowerPoint's not super important. It just has the chapter numbers where we're at. So we're going to be in the book of Esther and talking about that. It's really kind of an interesting story because we're talking about Babylon. This is a people that don't have any kind of connection with the one true God. And we're introduced to a king named Ahasuerus. Can you say Ahasuerus? Ahasuerus, that's a fun one to say. Depending on the translation that you're using, they will sometimes call him Xerxes. Can you say Xerxes? That's a little bit easier to say. But so whether you call him Ahasuerus or whether you call him Xerxes, it's the same king. And this guy has been in power for 3 years and decides, hey, you know what, I'm pretty great. I'm gonna throw a party. So he does an open house type thing, which is really, really common in Indiana, where he invites everybody over to see his palace and his gardens and all of the riches and the wealth that he has. For 180 days, he leaves his home open to whoever wants to come see, rich or poor, just come see how great I am. So for 180 days, he puts himself on display. And there's gold to sit on, gold couches, mosaic tiles. The fabric is white. The fabric is purple. These are both really, really expensive type things. And so then he says, all right, let's have a party. And so for 7 days, they hold this big feast. And he says, look, you guys are going to drink wine out of goblets of gold. Everybody's going to have a different goblet to drink out of, and you can drink however you want to drink. You're not obligated to follow any kind of customs. Just when you want more wine, there's going to be more wine for you. So this is a big extravagant party that he's hosting, and he's very impressed with himself. So he says, hey guys, my wife is awesome. I can relate to that. But what he does, I cannot relate with. He says, I'm going to call my wife, tell her to put on her crown so that you guys can just see how beautiful she is. And she says, no, that's not happening. Well, this is the king of the nation, which I put this map up here for you. This is a huge, huge nation. It stretches from India to Ethiopia. So this is kind of a ... It continues going south. There's at least 127 provinces here. And so we're here in Susa, which is the capital, the citadel city. But he runs all of this. And he says, hey, come show yourself off for my friends. And she says, no, that's not happening. And what's interesting here, because we've talked about Genesis, haven't we? The first 3 chapters of Genesis. What was the promise that God made to Eve? There's going to be enmity between you and the snake. There's going to be pain in childbearing. You're going to desire to rule over your husband. It's not going to happen. So I'm not saying that either of these people are behaving in what we would consider an honorable way. But it's interesting to see at this point in a different nation that stuff is coming true. Just an interesting side note. So her name is Vashti. And the king is kind of a smart guy, and he says, hey, wise men. He's got some wise men. He says, guys, what do I do about this? I asked my wife to come, she didn't come. And these guys, I'm not sure where they're at, but they're thinking, gosh, this is monumental. This is a huge deal. This doesn't just affect King Ahasuerus. This also affects the whole kingdom, because when women across the country hear that Vashti didn't come when King Ahasuerus called, then they're all going to rebel against their husbands. So you have to issue an edict. and say she's never allowed to come into your presence again, which is probably overkill. Definitely not on par with where they're at, but he doesn't. He writes it into law. Vashti cannot come into my presence again. And when a Persian king makes a law, it can't be revoked. He can't unwrite it. They can't amend the Constitution, as it were. It's stuck forever in stone because they literally had to write on rocks. So, in chapter 2, we see the king a little bit sober. And he says, man, that was a mistake. I missed Vashti. So these young guys, these young king's servants are like, hey, why don't you just gather up a bunch of virgins and pick the one that you like best, and she can take Vashti's place. Kind of questionable from our perspective, but he says, yeah, that's a great idea. Let's do it. So we're introduced to a guy named Mordecai. And Mordecai was an Israelite. He was one of God's people. And his great-grandfather had been captured by the Babylonians. And so his family had been around Susa, had been in the kingdom of Persia for more than 100 years. He was born there. And yet he knew his heritage. And we're introduced to his cousin. Her name is Hadassah. And she apparently was really pretty. But he was raising his cousin Hadassah because her parents had died. She had no one to take care of her, which is really a sad story in our day. But even worse when you think about in their culture and their time when women didn't have an opportunity to earn wages for themselves. This is a bad situation. You probably know her by her Persian name, which is Esther. So we meet this young lady who is hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of miles away from her homeland, whose family has been taken and conquered by another nation, whose parents are dead. If there's anybody in the whole wide world who has a reason to be bitter and bitter towards God, I can understand it being her. If there's anybody who has ever felt forsaken by God, I can see Esther being that person. So she's orphaned. She's being raised by her cousin. And the king decides he wants virgins to select from, and she's taken. And from the text, we don't know whether she went willingly or whether she was forced to go. We don't know exactly what her attitude was about the situation. Other than that, she was told to go by the king of Persia, and she went. Now, I'm not a woman. I can't relate to some of the feelings that you may be feeling right now when you're hearing this story about a young lady who's taken by a man to be assessed for her quality of queenship. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. But again, not only was it bad enough that she was orphaned and in a foreign land, but now she's taken and put into this new situation, which likely was very unpleasant. But what's astounding about this young lady is that she works really, really hard and gains the favor of the people who are over her. Instead of being bitter, instead of being angry about this, she works. It's an active thing. She earned their favor. It just happened. She didn't just happen to be a good person and, whatever. She earned and she worked. And she made the best of what she could do. She took the advice of some of the eunuchs, the people who had been in charge of her in the harem, when she said, "How do I please the king?" She has one opportunity, one night. And I don't know that it's necessarily reading between the lines to say that this is a sexual encounter. This is a young woman who is a virgin, who's been trained to please the king, and she has one opportunity to do that. This is uncomfortable. And it's even more uncomfortable when she does really well. And the king likes her more than any other woman. And he names her the queen instead of Vashti. That's how she got to her position. Well, she happened to also put in a good word for Mordecai, and it seems like Mordecai becomes one of the king's servants. Even if he doesn't actually become the king's servant, he sits with them. He's hanging out with them. He's an equivalent to them. So whatever his position is, it's something a little bit more respectable than, a slave from Israel. Well, as Mordecai's sitting around and hanging out with the king's servants, he overhears these two guys that are saying, hey, look, we're really, really upset. You know how, you've probably never talked or overheard two men who were upset about something, right? And so he listens in, and they're like, yep, we're gonna lay hands on the king. We're gonna assassinate him, we're gonna kill him. And he tells Esther, and Esther tells the king that Mordecai overheard this, and they investigate and find out that it's true. And so Mordecai saves the king's life, kind of accidentally. He was in the right place at the right time. A little bit of coincidence, if you will. So the party started in the 3rd year of his reign. Do you remember that? And then he chooses Esther in the 7th year of his reign. There's 4 years there. But Esther wasn't the only one who won favor with the king, because we read in chapter 3 that there was a man named Haman in the 12th year of his reign, so 5 years later, who was also winning the favor of the king. He was advanced to the king's second in command, and he's really following his mentor. He thinks he's really great stuff. And so much so that he asks the king, well, it's not explicit that he asks the king, but the king says, hey, when my man Haman walks through, you guys need to bow down and respect him. Okay, so the king's servants, they do what the king says. When Haman walks through, they bow down to pay honor to him, except Mordecai. Because I'm not doing that. Never. So day after day, Haman walks through, and these guys bow down to him, they show him honor, and Mordecai doesn't. Like, I'm not doing that. And they argue with him. Why are you doing this? Why are you disobeying the king's command? And he's like, well, I'm a Jew. I'm from Israel. Over and over, day after day. So finally, they pointed out to Haman, who apparently hadn't noticed before. But when he does realize what's happening, he's angry. And he wants to kill Mordecai. Not only does he want to kill Mordecai, now he knows that he's a Jew from Israel, and he wants to kill all the Israelites. And he tries to figure out a way to do that. He casts a lot. The Hebrew word is pur, pure, P-U-R. He casts a lot. Day after day, month after month. And it seems like he does it for a whole year. Looking for when is a good time to destroy God's people, the Israelites. That's a pretty, you have to commend him. I mean, that's a long time to seek God for something, right? For 12 months. And not that he necessarily has the best of intentions. He wants to kill people. But he's a persistent guy. We'll say that, right? We'll at least give him some kind of a credit. So finally, he realizes, he lands on the 12th month and the 13th day. It probably was a Friday. And he says, look, king, there's these people in your nation. In this whole broad land that you own, there's this group of people that were taken and deported, and they're not really significant. but they don't really obey your laws, and it's not in your best interest to keep them around. So I'm going to pay 100,000 talents of silver, tons and tons, literal tons, like 34 tons of silver into the king's treasury, so that we can just have people annihilate them on one day of the year. Just one day, let them go out there and kill everybody. I'll pay them, and these people will be taken care of. And the king says, yeah, whatever you want. Here's my ring. Get it done. I don't care. So Haman writes up the law, and he sends it out to all of the 127 provinces, every one of them in their own nation, so that they all in their own language, so that they understand what's going on, right? And the city of Susa is confused. The king just suddenly issues this decree, hey, on one day of the year, you are allowed to go and kill anybody of this nation, and you can take any of their stuff that you want to. They're really confused. They're kind of in an uproar. And you know what Haman and the king do? They relax. They have a drink. Business is done for the day. All right. Well, when Mordecai hears about this, he's understandably alarmed. He's upset. He tears his clothes. He puts on sackcloth, which is just an itchy fabric to show how upset he is. This is an outward demonstration of how upset he is. He puts on sackcloth and he puts ashes on his head and he weeps. And he goes around publicly and he goes up to the palace. No one who is that upset is allowed to actually go in to the palace. Probably some wisdom in that rule. But he goes up to the gate of the palace and he's lamenting and weeping and mourning, and he's very upset. And so everybody says, hey Esther, your cousin, he's a little freaked out right now. So she sends a messenger to him. His name is Hathach, and says, hey, what's up? Haman says, look, this is what happened. Haman has figured out a way to convince the king to let everybody kill us and take all of our stuff on one day of the year. Here, I will give you a copy of the edict, a copy of the decree, a copy of the letter. Go and beg the king to fix this. Esther sends a reply. Everybody knows that I can't go in. Nobody can go into the king unless he asks for them to come. You don't ring his doorbell without having called first. And usually it's not you calling, it's him calling you. And if he didn't call you and you show up and he didn't want to see you, you're dead. Period. End of the line. Esther says, Mordecai, everybody knows that's the rule. And he hasn't called for me in a month. So maybe the relationship's a little bit rocky. Not real sure, but he hasn't called for her in a month. So he sends a reply. Esther, if you don't do something, there's going to be relief for the Jews from somewhere. God will provide a relief for his people in some way. Do you think that you're going to escape this annihilation? If you don't do something, you will surely be destroyed, you and your father's house. But God will provide relief some other way. Maybe God puts you in this situation through an uncomfortable means so that when this situation arose, you would be in a place that you could address it. So she sends a reply. Pray for me. Pray for me for 3 days. Let's pray and let's fast. You guys pray and fast, and we're going to pray and fast, and then I'll go and I'll do it. And this is what's interesting to me. And if I perish, I perish. Now I'm an American, right? I like Burger King because I get things my way. Not like another restaurant that I've heard about recently here in town, which they explicitly have said, we are not Burger King, you don't get it your way. But I'm an American, I like things my way, and so if I go to God, and I have fasted, and I have prayed for 3 days, God better do whatever it is I've asked him to do, right? I have earned a positive answer to my prayer. 3 days without eating, that's a big deal. Not only me, but all of my friends and all of my cousin's friends. So she says, we're going to do this, but if I perish, I perish. This is a faith in God that knows she cannot manipulate him to do what she wants. This is an astounding faith. It is uncommon. We like to think that if we do the right things, then God will do the things we want for him to do. But God will not be manipulated. He loves us and he cares about us and he sees our situation. He knows that we feel forsaken by him. And he feels compassion for us, but he will not be manipulated into doing our will. He does his own. So she says, if I perish, I perish. After all of this, I'll go to the king and he might kill me, and that's the end of the story. But if you know the story, you know that he doesn't kill her. She walks in after having prayed for 3 days, and he's kind of happy to see her. He extends the golden scepter, and she goes up and touches. He says, what do you want, Esther? I will give you anything. And she says, well, come to dinner. I've already prepared a dinner, a banquet, for you and your main man, Haman. So let's do dinner tonight. He says, all right, let's do it. So they go and they have dinner. And they're drinking the wine afterwards, and the king says, all right, so what was the real reason that you wanted to see me today? And she says, well, if I found favor in your sight, if you still really, really like me, then let's do dinner again tomorrow. Okay. You and Haman, let's do dinner again tomorrow. And then I'll tell you what's on my mind. All right. Well, imagine you're Haman. You're the number 2 in the kingdom. You got invited to a private dinner between the king and the queen. You're the only guy there. So you're kind of on cloud 9 when you're leaving. Not only did you get to go tonight, you're going again tomorrow. Got the repeat invitation. You didn't make a fool of yourself, because I know I would have. So he's pretty excited about this. But as he's walking out, everybody bows and pays honor to him, except one guy. Mordecai does his thing. And so he comes from cloud 9, where he's having the best day of his life, to just furious at Mordecai. Why does this guy not get how great I am? Doesn't he understand? Everybody else gets it but this guy. And he's angry. So he calls his friends, he whines to them, he calls his wife, he whines to them. Don't you guys know what Mordecai's doing to me? This guy's a big jerk. And his wife says, well, hey, why don't you kill him tomorrow before your dinner, then you can enjoy your dinner. He says, that's a great idea. We'll kill him. I'm gonna build up a gallows, or I'm gonna build a stake. I don't see small children. Your text will say that they built a gallows. Really, they built a stake, a big stick with a sharp end on one end, and they would literally just put the person's body on the stake and just kind of let them slide down. It's a lot more graphic image than being hanged. These guys were not very pleasant people. But he builds a gallows, he builds a stake 75 feet tall in front of his house to put Mordecai on. And it looks like bad news, right? As a matter of fact, it was bad news. But the king couldn't sleep that night. Coincidentally. And so he calls for the book of the Chronicles of the Kings. You know, what are all the great things that I've done in my kingdom? What are all the things that have happened that were of significance? And so he says, you guys read this to me, I can't sleep. So they do. And they get to the part where Mordecai, revealed that these two guys were going to kill the king. And he's like, hey, what did we do for that guy Mordecai? Well, we didn't do anything. We never did anything for him. He's like, all right, well, who's out in the court right now? Well, Haman's walking in. He's walking in right now, coincidentally. And he says, all right, we'll call Haman. Haman, you're my second-hand man. Tell me, if I wanted to show honor to somebody, then what would I do? How could I show somebody honor that I really want to? And Haman's thinking, well, who is going to want to be honored? Or who is the king going to want to honor other than me? So he says, you know what, king? Take one of your royal robes that you have worn. That it's totally, it's like kingly. take your kingly robe, and take your kingly horse, one of the horses that you've ridden, and put this man in your robe and put him on your horse, and get one of your best officials to parade him through the streets and say, look, the king wants to honor this guy. And the king says, that's a great idea. Go do everything you've said for Mordecai. Oh, I was just going to talk to you about that guy. Really? Yeah. He saved my life once. Go do that. Well, if we can give him any credit, he actually goes and does it. He puts a robe on Mordecai. That had to be an awkward moment. And he puts him up on a horse and he parades him through the town yelling, this is the man that the king wants to honor. Just ignore that steak I put up last night. This is the guy. And so he's understandably upset. And he goes to his wife and his friends and says, look, this is what happened today, guys. It was terrible. And as he's whining and complaining, the king's eunuchs come to take him to dinner. He's got dinner. Let's read Esther chapter 7 together. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, what is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you, and what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled. And then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who has dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And the king rose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house? As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. When Haborna, one of the eunuchs in attendance of the king, said, moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high. And the king said, hang him on that. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. So coincidentally, Haman's killed on that which he had prepared for Mordecai. How can you not see God in this story? His name is never here. But all of these coincidences have worked together for this moment, where the king realizes and is angry about what is happening. These people were hard-hearted. They put people on poles and watched them die. They're not necessarily the nicest people. And so for just the news that a whole people was going to be annihilated might not have been a big deal to him. He was a king. He went to war and he killed people. But not only did this come to his attention, but he was moved by it. But it didn't solve the big problem, because remember, when the king makes a law, it can't be undone. And so Haman is taken care of. And they actually end up giving all of Haman's possessions to Mordecai, ironically. But there's still this law in the books that one day of the year, they can go out and kill Jews. All of them. Eliminate them, destroy them, and take all their stuff. So what God does, he takes Esther back into the king's presence, where she begs and pleads, please do something about this. Well, if you can't revoke the law, then make a new one, making it really, really difficult to execute the old one. So that's what he does. Where the law had said that anybody could go out and kill Jews on this one day, Esther wrote a new law. Esther and Mordecai together wrote a new law that says the Jews can get together on that day and they can defend themselves. They can be armed and prepared for battle. And they can kill anybody who tries to kill them. They can defend themselves. And so they write the law and it goes out. And where the people had been confused by the first law, there was a lot of rejoicing about the second law. This is good news that's come. And the day comes around. And the people gather, the Jews gather, the Israelites gather, and they defend themselves. And they kill the people who were trying to kill them. This Holocaust is prevented. And a weird thing happens. The king says, are you satisfied? He goes to Esther, are you satisfied? Well, let's do this another day tomorrow. Let's do this tomorrow too. And so in Susa, in the capital city, the Jews do it again. Which, it kind of makes me uncomfortable. But God has taken these people who could have easily been destroyed, who were already being judged for their sin. He could have easily let them perish. Because if you remember the map, Israel, the nation, Jerusalem, was under his reign. The whole nation, the whole people could have been destroyed on this day. They had permission to do it. Well, they institute a party, a festival, a celebration called Purim, because remember Haman cast lots, cast a pur to determine what day. So now they use that as the name of the celebration, saying, hey, look, this we didn't get destroyed that day. Remember? That was really cool. And they have a big party and they exchange gifts, and it's really a time of celebration. But for us here this morning, why is this significant? Because I don't think any of us are of Jewish descent, right? Can we go to I think it's the last slide. And this is in your bulletin. God still preserves his people even when he has forsaken them for their persistent sin. See, the nation of Israel was in Persia, taken by Babylon because they had continued to sin. Persistent, they had sinned. And they could have easily been annihilated because they had not listened to God. But God still has provided a way to preserve them. He kept the promises he made to Abraham. He could have, that could have been God's loophole. Do you realize that? Like, I'll be faithful to you if you're faithful to me, but then, hey, everybody died. Oops, I don't have to be faithful to a bunch of dead people, right? That could have been God's loophole. But it wasn't. He used uncomfortable situations, uncomfortable circumstances, and what we might consider coincidences to preserve his people. Now, this is, I think, what they normally would call Palm Sunday, right? And this week coming up would be Passover. And it might seem like I have completely missed over that. But all of this whole series is coming to a point next week. We're moving towards something. When we feel forsaken by God, how do we deal with that? And I don't want to reveal too much, but all of this points to Jesus. Actually, I do. I want you to know. That's where we're going. that God knows that Abraham experienced God knows that Adam experienced separation from him because of his sin. God knows that Job experienced this forsaken feeling. God knows that Saul did this. God knows what Esther went through in her life. He knows about all these things. But next week we'll see not only does he know about feeling like God has forsaken you and left you and abandoned you, he has experienced it himself in his son Jesus Christ. That's where we're going. And that is our hope. That's our hope this morning. And if God had not preserved his people through this young lady, through uncomfortable and awkward circumstances, that would have ended Jesus' heritage too. He couldn't be born if his great-great-grandfather was killed on that day. God still preserves his people, even when he's forsaken them for their persistent sin. So this morning, we invite you now to look at your connection cards there. There's a space there for you to respond. If God is saying something to you very specifically, then write that down. We want to be able to walk with you and pray with you through what God is doing in your life. And as you're leaving this afternoon, we're not afternoon yet, I'm sorry. Didn't mean to scare you. As we're leaving this morning, there's a basket out in the foyer. Just drop that in there, and we'll pick that up and we'll pray for you. But let's take a few moments now and reflect on what we've seen in God's Word this morning and what he's doing in our hearts today.
God, you're near in the quiet. Oh God, you're near in the shadow. Oh God, you're near at my breaking. Oh God, you're near. Oh God, you never leave my side. Your love stands firm for all my life. In my searching, oh God, you're near. In my wandering, oh God, you're near. When I feel alone, oh God, you're near. At my lowest, oh God, you're near. You're near. My us apart, and we are joined as one by your blood. And hope will rise as we become more than conquerors through the one who loved the world. I nor death nor anything else could pull us apart, and we are joined as one by your blood. Hope will rise as we become more than conquerors through the one who loved the world. Oh God, you never leave my side. Your love stands firm for all my life. Oh God, you never leave my side. Your love stands firm for all my life.